There are moments in life when everything seems to blur, when direction, purpose, and identity all feel uncertain. It's not exactly sadness and it's not exactly fear. It's a quiet, heavy confusion like standing in fog, unable to see the next step forward. This experience of feeling lost isn't rare or abnormal. It's a deeply human response when the structures that once gave life meaning no longer fit who we've become. In psychology, this experience is often linked to what Erik Erikson, 1959, called identity diffusion, a state of uncertainty about values, goals, and sense of self. It's a period when the inner compass seems to malfunction, leaving us unsure of what truly matters. This doesn't mean identity is gone. Rather, it's in transition, moving between what was once stable and what is yet to form. From a neuroscientific perspective, this sense of disorientation often activates the default mode network, the part of the brain associated with self-reflection and mind-wandering. Rachel et al. 2001. When life loses structure, the brain fills the silence with introspection. But if that reflection turns repetitive or unresolved, it can easily slip into rumination, the mental loop that deepens confusion instead of clarifying it. Emotionally, feeling lost can bring a kind of psychological numbness. Research on emotional regulation, Gross, 1998, shows that when the mind feels overwhelmed, it sometimes shuts down emotional intensity as a defense. This can feel like detachment, not caring, not feeling motivated, when in reality the psyche is conserving energy until clarity returns. It's important to remember that this phase is not a failure. Developmental psychologist Jeffrey Arnott 2000 describes such periods, especially in emerging adulthood, as normal transitions, times when identity expands and restructures. The same process can happen again later in life, during moments of reinvention or existential reevaluation. So feeling lost is not an absence of identity, it's the awareness that our old map no longer fits the territory. It's the beginning of reorientation, the moment the mind senses that growth is required, even before it knows where that growth will lead. Feeling lost rarely appears out of nowhere. It's usually the outcome of deeper shifts, internal, developmental, and situational. One of the most common roots lies in identity transitions. Many people first experience this in adolescence, but it often resurfaces in adulthood, during job changes, the end of relationships, or major life milestones that challenge who we thought we were. When our external world changes faster than our internal sense of self can adapt, we enter a psychological gap between the old identity and the new one trying to emerge. From a cognitive standpoint, Leon Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance, 1957, helps explain this discomfort. When our behaviors, roles, or life choices no longer align with our inner beliefs, it creates tension, a deep mental unease. That tension often feels like being lost, because our inner narrative no longer matches the life we're living. The mind resists the mismatch, urging us to realign or redefine ourselves. Attachment theory also offers insight. According to John Bowlby, 1969, our early attachment experiences shape how secure we feel in the world. Individuals with insecure attachment styles often internalize uncertainty about love, self-worth, and belonging. As adults, this can translate into chronic self-doubt and an ongoing search for external validation. The result is an unstable sense of direction, as if identity must constantly be proven or earned. But not all roots are personal, many are societal. Psychologist Roy Baumeister, 1991, described the narrative self, the story we tell about who we are. In modern life, that story is often guided by social norms, success, productivity, stability. When those external markers stop providing fulfillment, the story collapses. The rise of social media amplifies this collapse. Festinger's social comparison theory, 1954, shows how comparing ourselves to others shapes self-evaluation. In digital culture, we're flooded with endless examples of better paths, constantly reminding us what we could be but aren't. So the feeling of being lost isn't just a random emotional state. It's the psyche's signal, a quiet but profound message that something in our inner world no longer aligns with the outer one. It's not the end of certainty, but the beginning of honesty, an invitation to realign life with our deeper truth. Our sense of self isn't a fixed thing, it's a story we keep telling. Psychologist Dan McAdams, 2001, described identity as a narrative we construct to make sense of who we are and where we're going. When that story breaks through a major change, failure, or emotional upheaval, we lose the thread that gives our life coherence. Suddenly, the plot doesn't make sense anymore. We know what used to define us, but not what will. Moments like breakups, career disruptions, or even moving to a new place can interrupt this inner narrative. The continuity between past, present, and future feels fractured. It's not just confusion, it's the loss of the emotional glue that holds our story together. In those times, the brain struggles to integrate new experiences into an old identity framework, and what emerges is a sense of fragmentation. I don't know who I am anymore. From a psychodynamic perspective, this fragmentation often reflects inner conflict. Carl Jung described the process of individuation, where unconscious parts of the self seek recognition and integration. When these hidden aspects begin to surface, desires, fears, parts we've repressed, the conscious self can feel destabilized. The feeling of being lost, then, is not a failure of character but a sign that the psyche is reorganizing, attempting to become more whole. Existential psychology offers a similar view. Viktor Frankl wrote that meaninglessness isn't a sickness but a call to reconstruct purpose. When our old sources of meaning lose relevance, confusion becomes the starting point of growth. The breakdown of coherence pushes us to ask questions we might otherwise avoid. What truly matters now? What's worth continuing for? And often this loss of structure reveals how dependent we've become on our roles, the job title, the relationship, the social image. When those external identities vanish, we realize how fragile our sense of self can be. Yet within that realization lies opportunity. Feeling lost can be the first stage of authentic reconstruction, the moment we stop performing who we were and start becoming who we actually are. When we feel lost for an extended period, the emotional impact can be profound. The uncertainty drains energy mentally, emotionally, and even physically. Psychologist Christina Maslech's 1981 research on burnout describes this state well: emotional exhaustion, reduced motivation, and a sense of detachment. It's not that we stop caring altogether, it's that the emotional fuel we once relied on no longer connects to a clear destination. This prolonged disconnection often gives rise to anxiety and depressive symptoms. Aaron Beck's Cognitive Theory of Depression, 1979, showed how distorted thinking, like believing we failed or have no control, can emerge when life feels directionless. Studies by Clark and Beck, 2010, further link this sense of meaning loss with negative cognitive loops that reinforce hopelessness. When we can't make sense of where we are, the mind fills that uncertainty with self-doubt. For some, the feeling deepens into derealization or depersonalization, moments when the world or even the self feels distant and unreal. Research by Simeon and colleagues, 2000, identified this as a common response to existential confusion or prolonged stress. The mind, unsure how to orient itself, creates psychological distance as a protective mechanism. These states also awaken self-criticism and shame. Studies on perfectionism, Flett and Hewitt, 2002, show that individuals who internalize societal standards of success are more likely to attack themselves when lost or uncertain. The narrative becomes harsh. I should have figured this out by now. That self-directed hostility deepens emotional fatigue and delays healing. And then there's isolation. When people feel lost, they often withdraw not because they want to, but because explaining their confusion feels impossible. Social psychologist John Cacioppo, 2008, found that loneliness doesn't just result from lack of contact, but from a sense of emotional disconnection. Feeling lost can create exactly that, a quiet separation from the rhythm of others. But it's crucial to understand, these reactions aren't signs of weakness or personal failure. They are natural psychological responses to disorientation, the mind's way of pausing, conserving, and recalibrating when its old roadmap stops working. When people describe feeling lost, they often speak as if they've misplaced something external: a goal, a purpose, a sense of direction. But often what's really happening is internal. The feeling of being lost can be a reflection of unconscious conflict, a silent tension between what we truly want and what we believe we're supposed to want. In psychoanalytic theory, this conflict represents a clash between desire and duty, the authentic self and the adaptive self that tries to meet external expectations. Sigmund Freud viewed such tension as the foundation of psychological symptoms. When impulses, needs, or emotions are repressed, they don't disappear, they resurface in disguised forms: confusion, apathy, or indecision. The more we suppress inner conflict, the more we experience it as not knowing what to do. The fog of lostness is often a defense against confronting competing inner truths. Defense mechanisms like denial, rationalization, or intellectualization protect us from that confrontation. We analyze instead of feeling. We distract ourselves with activity instead of reflection. Research on emotional avoidance, Hayes et al. 1996, suggests that avoiding uncomfortable thoughts only strengthens them over time. The energy spent on suppression becomes the emotional weight we later experience as being stuck. Carl Jung's idea of the shadow adds another dimension. The shadow represents the parts of ourselves we disown: anger, ambition, vulnerability, or creativity, traits we've learned to hide to maintain acceptance. When these neglected parts begin to surface, the ego feels destabilized. Confusion and restlessness are often signals that something within is asking to be integrated, not ignored. Interestingly, studies on dreaming support this process. Ernest Hartman, 1996, found that during periods of psychological transition, dream intensity often increases. The unconscious in its symbolic language tries to communicate what the conscious mind resists. Similarly, anthropologist Victor Turner's concept of liminality, 1969, the in-between phase during rites of passage, mirrors this idea. In liminal states, old identities dissolve before new ones emerge, and that dissolution can feel chaotic. So rather than viewing feeling lost as a malfunction, it can be seen as a reorganization of the psyche. The unconscious is reshaping old patterns, challenging false identities, and pushing for authenticity. What feels like disorientation on the surface is often the mind preparing for deeper psychological alignment. It's easy to assume that feeling lost is a purely personal issue, but in many ways it's also a social phenomenon. The world we live in constantly shapes what we think a fulfilled life should look like. From a young age, we're taught to follow a linear life path, study hard, find a career, build stability, stay productive. These milestones become psychological anchors. Yet when life inevitably deviates from that sequence, many feel as though they've failed when in truth, they're simply living outside a cultural script that was never universal to begin with. Erich Fromm explored this tension into Have or to Be, 1976, where he argued that modern societies condition us to define ourselves through possession, what we have, not who we are. The having mode of existence creates a fragile identity. When possessions, achievements, or status symbols fade, so does self-worth. The result is an inner void, a feeling of being lost not because we lack direction, but because we've been chasing the wrong compass. This dynamic is amplified by social media, which through its constant performance of curated selves, strengthens what D.W. Winnicott 1960 called the false self. The false self forms when we adapt too much to external expectations, presenting what's acceptable rather than what's authentic. Online, that adaptation becomes a lifestyle. We perform confidence, clarity, and happiness while privately questioning our own lives. The more we perform, the further we drift from the genuine self beneath the presentation. The workplace adds another layer. Research on role engulfment, Ashforth 2001, shows how professional identity can consume personal identity. When we equate worth with productivity, a career setback or job loss doesn't just challenge stability, it challenges identity itself. In a society that values output over being, rest and reflection can feel like failure, even though they're necessary for psychological integration. All of this contributes to what psychologists Robinson and Wright, 2013, described as the modern quarter-life and midlife crises, periods where people, despite apparent success, feel internally adrift. These crises are not random, they're the natural consequence of living in cultures that prioritize image and achievement over inner coherence. So when we feel lost, it's not just a personal flaw, it's also a reflection of the collective pressures we live under. Society often rewards conformity but punishes introspection. Yet, ironically, it's introspection that helps us find meaning again. Feeling lost, then, can be seen as a quiet act of rebellion, the mind's way of stepping back from the noise of expectation to ask, who am I really beneath all of this? Once the feeling of being lost sets in, the mind can unintentionally sustain it. It's not that we want to stay confused, it's that our cognitive habits start reinforcing the fog instead of clearing it. One of the most common of these habits is rumination. Psychologist Susan Nolan Hoeksema, 2000, found that repetitive self-focused thinking, going over the same worries, regrets, or what-ifs, not only deepens emotional distress but also blocks problem-solving. The more we think about feeling lost, the more the feeling grows, feeding a self-perpetuating cycle of mental stagnation. Another powerful pattern is cognitive fusion, a concept from acceptance and commitment therapy, Hayes et al., 1999. Cognitive fusion happens when we become so entangled with our thoughts that we start treating them as absolute truths. For example, the thought "I have no direction" becomes "I am someone with no direction." That fusion cements the emotion, transforming a temporary state into an identity. Then there's black and white thinking, the mind's demand for certainty. It insists that we must either have everything figured out or be completely lost. Psychologists link this cognitive rigidity to heightened anxiety because it leaves no room for the ambiguity that naturally exists in human growth. The more we try to force clarity, the further we move from genuine understanding. Memory also plays a role. Aaron Beck's 1979 work on cognitive distortions showed that the brain tends to prioritize negative memories when identity feels threatened. In times of confusion, we selectively recall past failures or moments of doubt, reinforcing a distorted self-narrative. This bias makes it hard to remember evidence of resilience or growth, the very things that could counterbalance the feeling of being lost. Finally, a breakdown in attentional control can deepen the disorientation. Studies on mind-wandering, Killingsworth and Gilbert, 2010, reveal that when our attention drifts excessively into the past or future, our sense of presence weakens. The present moment, where clarity actually forms, becomes inaccessible. It's like being mentally everywhere except here. But understanding these patterns isn't about blame, it's about awareness. The mind creates confusion not because it's broken, but because it's trying to make sense of uncertainty with the tools it has. Recognizing these cognitive habits is the first step in loosening their grip, not by fighting the confusion, but by observing it with patience and curiosity. Beyond the psychological and social layers of feeling lost lies something even deeper, the existential dimension. This is where the experience stops being just about circumstances and becomes about meaning itself. Existential psychologists like Irvin Yalom, 1980, describe these moments as crises of meaning, times when the old frameworks that once guided us collapse, leaving us face to face with life's vast openness. The questions shift from "what should I do?" to "why am I doing anything at all?" When familiar sources of purpose, career, relationships, religion, identity lose their emotional weight, we confront what Jean-Paul Sartre called the burden of freedom. Sartre argued that freedom can be terrifying because it strips away excuses. When life stops telling us what to be, we must choose for ourselves, and that radical freedom can create intense anxiety. This anxiety isn't a flaw, it's the cost of self-awareness. It means we've recognized that meaning is given, it's created. The existential perspective also recognizes the role of mortality awareness. Terror management theory, Greenberg, Pyszczynski, and Solomon, 1986, shows that awareness of death, even at an unconscious level, can trigger both fear and a drive to find meaning. When we lose direction, our mortality becomes louder in the background, pushing us to redefine what truly matters before time runs out. For some, this period includes a loss of spiritual grounding. Studies on spiritual crises, Lukoff, 1985, note that questioning long-held beliefs or values can feel like psychological freefall. What once provided certainty and comfort now feels hollow or untrue. Yet such crises often precede deeper faith or philosophical maturity, a shift from blind belief to personal understanding. At the heart of this existential confusion lies a paradox. We are wired to seek coherence, to make sense of our lives through story and meaning. When that sense disintegrates, we experience what some psychologists call existential vertigo, a dizzying awareness of infinite possibilities and no fixed anchor. But that vertigo is not a sign of collapse, it's a sign of expansion. So when you feel lost at this level, it may be consciousness stretching beyond its old boundaries, realizing that life's meaning cannot always be inherited or borrowed. It must at some point be created from within. If we look closely, many psychological theories and even spiritual traditions point to a similar truth. Confusion often precedes transformation. The feeling of being lost can be the threshold of growth, not its opposite. Psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun, 1996, called this process post-traumatic growth, the positive psychological change that follows major disruption. When our internal maps fall apart, the mind is forced to build new ones. Out of chaos, coherence can emerge, but it's never the same as before. It's richer, deeper, and more authentic. From a neuroscientific view, this renewal is supported by the brain's neuroplasticity, its ability to rewire and adapt. Davidson, 2004. When familiar patterns of thought or identity dissolve, the brain begins forming new connections. The very discomfort that makes us feel lost also signals that the mind is reorganizing itself. We can think of confusion as the neural and psychological labor of becoming someone new. This process of psychological reconstruction doesn't happen overnight. It often begins quietly through reflection, new experiences, or small acts of courage that reconnect us to meaning. Over time, we begin to see how disorientation stripped away what was false or outdated. Philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche described this as creative destruction, the breaking apart of old forms to make room for new creation. In that sense, the breakdown is not the end of identity, but its renewal. Research on self-complexity, Linville, 1987, also supports this. People with more nuanced, flexible self-concepts, those who see themselves as more than one fixed identity, tend to recover faster from disorienting experiences. Each loss becomes an invitation to integrate new parts of the self, rather than collapse into confusion. Growth, then, is not about rebuilding the old structure, but expanding the range of who we can be. So when we talk about transformation, it's not about suddenly finding yourself. It's about slowly reconstructing meaning from the fragments, integrating pain, confusion, and self-awareness into something wiser. Feeling lost can be seen as the psyche's call to evolve, to transcend shallow forms of certainty and move toward authenticity. What feels like collapse from the outside is often rebirth from within.